She stepped off the train with hope in her eyes and a suitcase full of dreams. The letter said he'd be waiting, her future husband, her fresh start, her chance at love. But when she reached the small wooden house at the edge of the town, no one greeted her. Instead, the door creaked open slowly and 7 children stood silently, staring. No man, no smile, no explanation. Just tiny faces filled with fear, hunger, and something even deeper, loss. Her heart raced. Was this a cruel joke? Where was he? Why didn't anyone tell her the truth? She wanted to leave, but their eyes pulled her in. They didn't speak, but their silence screamed louder than words. In that moment, she realized this wasn't the life she was promised, but maybe, just maybe, it was the life she was meant to live. And what happened next, no one saw coming. She walked through the dusty path of a silent town, her shoes worn, her heart full of hope. She wasn't rich, but she believed in second chances. A letter had reached her weeks ago, a proposal from a man she'd never met, promising a new life, a home, a family. She held onto those words like a lifeline. As she approached the small wooden house at the end of the road, the wind whispered doubts, but she kept walking. She knocked once, then again. No answer. Slowly, the door opened with a soft creak. Standing in front of her were not flowers or a smiling husband, but 7 children, barefoot, quiet, wide-eyed. No man in sight, no warm welcome, just the cold reality of abandonment. Her heart sank. Had she been tricked? Was this a mistake? But the way those children looked at her, it wasn't fear. It was silent, desperate hope. She froze. 7 children, each one standing still like they'd forgotten how to move. The smallest, barely 4, clutched a ragged toy. The oldest, a thin boy with tired eyes, stepped forward and whispered, "Papa left. He never came back." His voice didn't shake. It was hollow, like he'd said those words too many times already. Her chest tightened. She looked past them, into the house. The air was thick, like it hadn't been opened in days. The floor creaked as she stepped inside. The smell of damp wood, old clothes, and silence hung everywhere. Plates were stacked in the sink, beds unmade, cold ashes in the fireplace. There was no sign of adult life, no shoes by the door, no coat on a hanger, no man at all. Just shadows and silence, and children who had been surviving on nothing but each other. She placed her bag down near the door, unsure if she should stay or turn back. This wasn't what she came for. She wasn't prepared for this. She had dreamed of a man with kind eyes, a simple wedding, a new beginning. But here she was standing in a broken home filled with lost little souls. Her mind told her to walk away, that this wasn't her problem. But something stronger held her feet in place. The way the youngest girl peeked at her from behind a curtain, the way the middle child tried to hide a tear, those silent cries gripped her more than any spoken words ever could. She walked into the kitchen and opened the cupboard. Empty. The refrigerator buzzed, but there was almost nothing inside. A single loaf of dry bread, 1 cracked egg, and a jar of something too old to name. Her stomach sank. How long had they been living like this? She turned around and saw them watching her, still quiet, still unsure. She knelt down slowly and asked, "When did he leave?" The boy looked away. 3 weeks ago. He said he was going to get food, but he didn't come back. Her breath caught. She had never felt so helpless or so needed. That night, she stayed. She made toast from the dry bread, split it into small pieces, and gave one to each child. They ate quietly, sitting on the floor, as if this had become normal. She wrapped the littlest one in her shawl and tucked her onto a couch. She didn't sleep. She just sat there, listening to their breathing, wondering why fate had led her here. She could have ignored the letter. She could have chosen a different path, but now she was here. And these children, these strangers, were looking at her like she was their last hope. She stared out the window, the moonlight painting soft shadows on the floor, and whispered to herself, "Maybe I didn't come here to find a husband. Maybe I came here to become something else." Deep down, she knew this wasn't the life she planned, but maybe, just maybe, it was the life that needed her most. The morning came without sleep. Her eyes burned, but she didn't move from the chair. One by one, the children woke up, their faces still holding yesterday's sadness. She stood, unsure what to say or do, but the smallest one reached out and held her hand. That tiny gesture told her everything. She had no experience being a mother, no job, no savings, and not even a plan, but she had something else presence. And maybe that was enough for now. The days ahead were hard. The house needed cleaning. The children needed food, clothes, love, everything. She walked to the nearest store, sold a small ring she'd kept hidden in her dress pocket, and bought bread, rice, milk, and soap. That night, she boiled rice with salt and told them a story she made up on the spot about a brave little girl who didn't know how strong she was until life gave her no choice. The children listened with wide eyes, then fell asleep curled around her like she'd been theirs forever. Every day it was a new challenge. The water heater didn't work, the roof leaked when it rained, and one of the kids had a terrible cough. She stitched torn socks at night by candlelight and washed dirty clothes with cold water in a broken tub. She made soup out of boiled vegetables and shared it equally among them, always pretending she wasn't hungry. She never said it out loud, but the truth was she often went to sleep on an empty stomach, not because there wasn't enough food, but because they needed it more than she did. And yet, she never let them see her struggle. She smiled when they smiled. She laughed at their silly jokes. She helped with homework, braided hair, and sang lullabies softly under her breath when nightmares woke them up. Over time, the fear in their eyes began to fade. They started calling her Mama, not all at once, but one by one, like small drops of trust filling a broken cup. The first time she heard it, her heart stopped. She turned away quickly so they wouldn't see the tears. That night, she sat alone at the kitchen table and cried not out of sadness, but because, for the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged. Not because someone had chosen her, but because she had chosen them. The struggle didn't stop. There were still nights when the roof leaked, and mornings when she worried about how to afford breakfast. But something inside her had changed. She was no longer waiting for someone to rescue her. She had become the one doing the rescuing, and in the eyes of 7 abandoned children, she wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was their mother, the one who stayed, the one who tried, the one who never gave up. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The house that once echoed with silence now carried the sound of laughter, footsteps, and bedtime songs. The roof still leaked when it rained, and the meals were still simple. But the air had changed. The children smiled more often, fought over chores like siblings, and hugged her without hesitation. They no longer watched her with caution, they trusted her with everything. One morning, the youngest girl came running into the kitchen, holding a folded piece of paper in her tiny hands. "I made something for you," she whispered. It was a drawing, done with broken crayons on the back of an old envelope. A crooked house stood at the center, surrounded by 7 stick-figure children. In the middle of them all was her with a big red heart drawn on her chest. She stared at it for a long time, unable to speak. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. That simple, childlike sketch said everything. She hadn't just taken care of them, she had become part of them, a piece of their story, a piece of their hearts. She folded the paper gently and placed it in her dress pocket, right where she once kept the letter that brought her here. But the letter meant nothing now. The man who wrote it never came back. No calls, no message, no explanation. She had stopped wondering why, stopped hoping he would return. Somewhere along the way, he stopped being the reason she stayed. Her days were no longer driven by what was missing but by what was in front of her, and what stood before her was more than enough. 7 children who laughed when she laughed, cried when she was tired, and held her hand when she needed strength. She had come to this town searching for love, and maybe she had found it, but not in the way she expected. Not from a man with promises, but from the hearts of those who had nothing, yet gave her everything. She looked at herself in the mirror one night and barely recognized the reflection. The sadness in her eyes had been replaced by something stronger: purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, building, healing. She had stopped being a visitor in their lives. She had become their home. And though the world outside still whispered doubts and judgment, inside that little house, she was enough, more than enough. The woman who once stood alone at a train station, waiting for a stranger's hand. now walked through her days holding the hands of 7 children, who believed she was exactly where she belonged. She no longer needed a rescue story. She had written her own. Years passed, and the little house that once held silence began to echo with achievements. The children she once fed with scraps became builders of dreams. One wore a white coat, another held a chalk in front of students, and one built homes like the one that saved them. They never forgot the woman who arrived as a stranger and stayed as their strength. They would often say, "She wasn't our real mother, but she was the mother we prayed for." Her name wasn't written on their birth certificates, but it was carved into their hearts. She didn't give them life, but she gave them everything that made life worth living. And though her hair turned gray and her steps slowed, her place in their world never changed. Because in the end, family isn't about blood, it's about love that never leaves, and she never left. That's what made her their forever home.